They said no one had stepped inside the Gatehouse tower in over 50 years, but the truth was, no one had ever bothered to look closely enough to understand what it really was. And the day Eleanor Price pushed open its rotting door with trembling hands and just $8 left in her pocket, she had no idea she wasn't just entering an abandoned structure. She was stepping into the one place that could rewrite everything that had been taken from her. Just 3 weeks earlier, Eleanor had still believed her life, though quieter now, still had some stability left, until the courtroom proved otherwise. At 69, she sat upright in a stiff wooden chair as the judge read out the final terms of a divorce she never truly saw coming, at least not like this. 42 years of marriage reduced to legal phrasing and cold signatures. Her husband, Gerald, never raised his voice, never made a scene. He didn't need to. He had spent the last 3 years quietly preparing, moving assets, restructuring accounts, transferring ownerships in ways Eleanor never questioned because she trusted him, because she thought decades of shared life meant something permanent. By the time she realized what had happened, it was already done. The house she believed they owned together was no longer in his name or hers. The savings had been redirected. The accounts she once had access to were closed, replaced, or emptied under legal technicalities she didn't understand. And when the judge finalized everything, Eleanor was left with what the paperwork called personal belongings of limited monetary value, and a sum so small it barely covered a week of groceries. She didn't cry in the courtroom. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, stood up, and walked out, as if accepting something she hadn't yet fully processed. It wasn't until she reached her purse later that evening, sitting alone on a bench outside a grocery store, that the reality settled in. $8. That was all she had. $8 and a suitcase filled with clothes that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The first night, she stayed at a budget motel on the edge of town, paying in cash, counting every coin twice before handing it over. The room smelled faintly of bleach and something older, something harder to clean out. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the patterned carpet, trying to figure out what came next, but there was no plan, no fallback, no quiet reserve waiting to be used. The next morning, she called her son. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She called her daughter instead, who picked up but hesitated too long before responding. "Mom, things are tight right now," she said, her voice careful, distant in a way Eleanor had never heard before. Maybe for a few days, but not long term. Eleanor said she understood, even though she didn't. Not really. Because understanding would mean accepting that the people she raised, the people she had spent years putting first, now saw her as something temporary, something inconvenient. She didn't push. She didn't beg. That wasn't who she had ever been. Instead, she returned to the motel for one more night, then checked out before they could ask for another payment she couldn't make. By the 3rd day, she found herself at a bus station, sitting quietly with her suitcase beside her, watching strangers move with purpose. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, someone waiting, some reason to keep moving forward. Eleanor had none of those things, not anymore. It was there, in that stillness, that she noticed the bulletin board. It wasn't anything special, just a corkboard covered in outdated notices, peeling flyers, and handwritten ads pinned unevenly across its surface. Jobs that no longer existed. Rooms already rented. Services no one called anymore. But in the bottom corner, barely held in place by a rusted pin, was a single printed sheet that looked newer than the rest. County property auction. Unclaimed structures. Minimum bid required. Cash only. She almost looked away. It wasn't meant for people like her. Auctions required money. More than $8, certainly. But something about the phrase, unclaimed structures, lingered in her mind. Unclaimed. Unwanted. Left behind. The words felt familiar in a way she couldn't ignore. She reached up slowly, pulling the paper free, scanning the list of properties included. Most were described in blunt, unappealing terms: condemned, structurally compromised, remote location, no utilities. But one entry stood out, not because it sounded better, but because it sounded different. Gatehouse Tower, former estate boundary structure, condition unknown, access restricted. She read it twice, then folded the paper carefully and placed it in her bag. She didn't tell herself she was going. She didn't make a plan. But the next morning, she found her feet carrying her in that direction anyway. The auction was held in a small municipal building that smelled faintly of paper and dust, with rows of metal chairs arranged in front of a long table where officials shuffled documents without looking up. There weren't many people there, just a handful of bidders, most of them seasoned, confident, speaking in low voices about properties and margins as if they were discussing routine purchases. Eleanor sat in the back, silent, unsure why she hadn't turned around yet. The auction began quickly, items moving faster than she could follow, numbers rising beyond anything she could imagine affording. She should have left. She almost did. But then the listing came up. Item 17, Gatehouse Tower. There was a brief pause, a subtle shift in the room's energy. Not interest, but the opposite. Disinterest. A few people glanced at their papers, then looked away. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Minimum bid, he asked, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. Eleanor felt her heart begin to pound, not from confidence, but from something closer to instinct. Before she could talk herself out of it, before logic could catch up, her hand lifted slightly. $8, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room turned, not in shock, but mild curiosity. The auctioneer blinked once, then twice, as if confirming he had heard correctly. $8 received, he said slowly. Any other bids? Silence. A longer pause this time. Then, with a soft strike of the gavel, sold. And just like that, without fanfare, without competition, Eleanor Price became the owner of a place no one else wanted. A forgotten gatehouse tower at the edge of nowhere. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't even feel relieved. Just different. Because for the first time since everything had fallen apart, something had shifted. She wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't asking. She had chosen something. Even if she didn't yet understand what that choice would cost her, or what it might give back. What no one told Eleanor Price. Not the disinterested clerk who stamped her receipt. Not the man who slid the thin packet of documents across the table. Not even the silence that followed her out of that municipal building. Was that the Gatehouse Tower wasn't just unwanted, it was avoided. And by the time she reached the end of the long, fractured road that led to it, she began to understand why. Because the place didn't look abandoned in the ordinary sense. It looked forgotten in a way that felt deliberate, as if time itself had stepped carefully around it and left it untouched for reasons no one cared to explain. The journey there took most of the day, a combination of a bus ride that dropped her miles from the listed address and a slow walk under a sun that felt harsher the longer she carried her suitcase, each step pulling her further from the life she once knew and deeper into something uncertain, something that didn't yet have a name. She asked for directions once, stopping at a small roadside store where an older man stood behind the counter, watching her with quiet curiosity as she unfolded the paper in her hands and pointed to the address. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for her to notice. "You're not from around here," he said, more observation than question. Eleanor shook her head. "Just need to know which way this is," she replied. He hesitated before answering, glancing once toward the road outside, as if measuring something unseen. "Keep straight for about 2 miles, he said finally. "You'll see an old iron fence. Can't miss it." Then, after a pause, he added, "Not much out there." Eleanor nodded, thanked him, and continued on her way, but she couldn't ignore the subtle weight behind his words. Not much out there didn't sound like a warning, but it didn't sound like reassurance either. By the time she reached the fence, she understood what he meant. It stretched along the roadside, rusted and bent in places, half swallowed by vines and overgrowth that had long since claimed it as their own. Beyond it, barely visible through the dense tangle of trees, stood the tower. Tall, narrow, stone rising in a way that felt older than anything around it. Its silhouette cutting into the sky like something that didn't belong to the present. There was no driveway, no clear path, just a break in the fence where the metal had collapsed inward, creating an opening just wide enough for her to step through. She paused there, her hand resting briefly on the cold, rough edge of the iron, her suitcase beside her, as a strange thought crossed her mind. Not doubt, not fear exactly, but awareness. No one had followed her here. No one knew she was here. And if she turned around now, nothing would stop her. But nothing would change either. So she stepped through. The ground on the other side was uneven, covered in layers of leaves and debris that crunched softly beneath her shoes as she moved forward, each step bringing the tower into clearer view, revealing details she couldn't see from the road. The cracks in the stone, the darkened windows clouded with years of dust, the heavy wooden door hanging slightly off its hinges as if it had been forced open long ago and never properly closed again. When she finally stood in front of it, Eleanor felt something unexpected, not disappointment, not regret, but a quiet recognition. This place, in all its neglect and silence, felt closer to her reality than anything else had in weeks. It wasn't pretending to be anything more than what it was. It didn't hide its damage. It didn't mask its emptiness. It simply existed, waiting for someone who had nothing left to lose. She reached out slowly, placing her hand against the door, and pushed. It resisted at first, then gave way with a low, drawn-out creak that echoed into the darkness beyond, as if announcing her presence to a space that hadn't heard footsteps in years. Inside, the air was thick and still, carrying the scent of dust, damp stone, and something older she couldn't quite identify. Light filtered in through the narrow windows, casting faint beams that revealed the interior in fragments. A circular room at the base, bare except for broken furniture pushed against the walls, a spiral staircase winding upward along the inner curve of the tower, and layers of neglect that spoke of decades without care. Eleanor stepped inside fully, letting the door fall partially closed behind her, the sound dull but final. For a moment, she stood there, listening, not for anything specific, just listening. But there was nothing. No movement. No distant noise. Just silence so complete it felt almost solid. She set her suitcase down carefully, then moved slowly around the room, brushing dust from surfaces, testing the strength of the floor beneath her feet, noting what was broken, what might still be usable. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. That first night, she didn't go upstairs. She didn't explore further than she needed to. Instead, she cleared a small area near one of the windows, laid out her coat as a makeshift cushion, and sat with her back against the cold stone wall, watching as the last light of the day faded into darkness. There was no electricity, no running water, no comfort beyond what she could create herself. And yet, as the night settled in, Eleanor realized something she hadn't felt since before the courtroom, before the motel, before the bus station. She wasn't being watched, judged, or tolerated. She simply was. The days that followed were harder than anything she had experienced in years, not because they were complicated, but because they were raw. She learned quickly where the roof leaked when it rained. She found a nearby stream after hours of searching, carrying water back in an old container she discovered behind the tower. She cleaned, slowly, methodically, clearing layers of dust and debris one section at a time, uncovering the structure beneath the neglect, the shape of something that had once been maintained, maybe even valued. Her hands grew sore, her movement slower, but she didn't stop, because every small change she made, every cleared surface, every repaired hinge, every swept corner, was proof that she still had the ability to build something, even from nothing. And then, about 3 weeks after she arrived, something changed. It started with the staircase. She had avoided going too far up, not out of fear, but practicality, focusing first on the space she needed to survive. But that morning, with the lower level finally clean enough to feel livable, she decided to climb. The steps creaked beneath her weight but held firm, spiraling upward into dim light that grew slightly brighter with each turn, until she reached a second level that opened into a narrower room lined with old shelves and a small, shuttered window. It was here, while clearing a section near the inner wall, that she noticed it. A seam, not in the stone itself, but along it. A faint line where the texture changed, where dust had settled differently, where something didn't quite match the rest of the structure. She brushed her hand across it, feeling the subtle difference beneath her fingers, then pressed lightly. Nothing. She tried again, this time with more pressure, and heard it. A dull, hollow sound that didn't belong to solid stone. Eleanor stepped back slightly, her mind shifting from routine to focus, from survival to curiosity. Because this wasn't just part of the tower. It was something added, hidden. She searched the surrounding area, moving debris, checking for anything that might explain it, until she found a small metal handle, nearly invisible beneath layers of grime, set low into the wall. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from something deeper. The same instinct that had made her raise her hand in that auction room, that had brought her here when logic said not to. She reached down slowly, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal, hesitating only for a moment before pulling. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the seam shifted. The section of wall moved inward slightly, revealing the edge of a concealed door. Eleanor froze, staring at it, her breath steady but her thoughts racing in quiet realization. This place wasn't just abandoned. It had been closed off, and whatever was behind that door had been left there on purpose. The moment Eleanor pulled that hidden door fully open, the truth of the Gatehouse Tower shifted from something forgotten into something deliberately preserved, because what waited behind it wasn't decay or collapse, but order, intention, and a silence that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt protected, and as she stepped inside with slow, measured caution, she realized she wasn't the first person to stand exactly where she was standing now, wondering why a place abandoned by everyone else had been sealed so carefully from the inside. The room was smaller than she expected, but unlike the rest of the tower, it was untouched by dust, as if time had been held back at the threshold, shelves lining the walls with neatly stacked boxes, papers tied with string, and at the center, a heavy wooden desk that looked as though someone had just stepped away from it moments ago, even though logic told her that couldn't be true. Eleanor didn't rush forward. She had learned too much in the past few weeks about patience, about letting things reveal themselves instead of forcing answers too quickly, so she moved slowly, her fingers brushing across the edge of the desk, leaving faint trails in the thin layer of settled air, before she noticed the first detail that made her chest tighten. The papers weren't random, they were labeled. Dates, names, property numbers, legal stamps. This wasn't storage. This was a record. She picked up the nearest file, her hands steady despite the quiet tension building inside her, and opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the first page before stopping completely as the meaning settled in. Land deeds. Not just one, but dozens. Parcels mapped out in precise detail, each one tied to the estate surrounding the tower, the same land she had walked past without thinking twice, believing it belonged to no one because it looked like it belonged to no one. But it did. Or at least, it had. She set the first file down and opened another, then another, her movements becoming quicker now, less cautious, driven by the growing realization that this wasn't coincidence. This wasn't forgotten paperwork left behind by accident. This was a system, something intentionally created and hidden. There were maps showing boundaries stretching far beyond what she had seen, tax records marked unresolved, legal correspondence that ended abruptly decades ago, and then, buried beneath a thicker stack of documents, a single folder that felt different the moment she touched it. Heavier, not in weight, but in significance. She opened it slowly, her breath catching as she saw the name written across the top in clean, deliberate ink. Henry Caldwell, estate trustee. The name meant nothing to her at first, but as she read, the pieces began to align. Caldwell had been responsible for managing the original estate generations ago, overseeing vast amounts of land that, over time, became entangled in disputes, missing heirs, contested claims, filings that were never completed. The kind of legal chaos that doesn't resolve itself. It just sits, waiting for someone persistent enough to untangle it. But Caldwell hadn't left it to chance. He had written instructions, not public ones, not official filings that could be challenged or altered, but private directives tied to one condition, repeated again and again across multiple documents, underlined, reinforced, impossible to misinterpret. The Gatehouse Tower. Ownership of the tower, legally transferred through county auction or abandonment claim, triggered a provisional right to re-establish control over the surrounding estate, if, and only if, the owner could prove continuous habitation and restoration of the structure itself. Eleanor sat down slowly in the chair behind the desk, the wood creaking softly beneath her as the weight of what she was reading settled into something real, something undeniable. This place, the thing no one wanted, the structure dismissed, ignored, left to rot, was never meant to be valuable on its own. It was a key, a filter, a test, that ensured only someone desperate enough, determined enough, or overlooked enough would ever claim it. And she had, without knowing, without planning. She had walked into the exact position Caldwell had designed decades earlier, the kind of opportunity that didn't look like opportunity until you were already inside it. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her eyes moving across the room again, seeing it differently now, not as a hidden space, but as a safeguard, a final layer protecting something most people would never have the patience to uncover. She spent hours going through the rest of the documents, piecing together timelines, identifying which parcels were still unclaimed, which filings had lapsed, which legal pathways were still open if someone pushed hard enough, long enough, and with the right proof. And that was the catch. Proof, not just of ownership, but of presence, of effort, of restoration. Everything she had already begun doing without realizing it mattered. That night, she didn't sleep on the floor downstairs. She stayed in that room, surrounded by the quiet evidence of a life she hadn't known existed for her just weeks ago, her mind working through the implications, the steps, the risks. Because this wasn't easy. It wouldn't be quick. The system that ignored her before wouldn't suddenly welcome her now. But she understood something differently this time. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't waiting for permission. She had leverage. Over the next several months, Eleanor worked harder than she ever had. Not just cleaning and repairing the tower, but documenting everything. Photographs, timelines, receipts, proof of continuous residence. She traveled back into town when she needed to, filing paperwork that clerks barely glanced at before realizing she wasn't going away, that she understood exactly what she was claiming and why it held weight. At first, they dismissed her. Then they questioned her. Then, slowly, they started processing her filings. Because the law, buried deep and rarely used, was still valid. And she was meeting every condition. A year later, the tower no longer looked abandoned. The stone had been cleaned, the door repaired, the windows cleared. It stood not as something forgotten, but as something reclaimed. And beyond it, the land began to follow. Parcels transferred, claims recognized, boundaries redrawn. Quietly, without headlines, without attention, Eleanor Price became the legal owner of property no one else had been willing to fight for. The same people who once looked past her now looked twice. The same system that reduced her to $8 now processed documents in her name with careful attention. And one afternoon, as she stood outside the tower, looking across land that now belonged to her in ways she once couldn't have imagined, a car pulled up along the broken road she had walked months before. Her daughter stepped out slowly, uncertain, her expression a mixture of relief and something harder to define. "Mom, we didn't know where you went," she said, her voice softer than Eleanor remembered. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked at the tower, at the door she had opened, at the life she had rebuilt piece by piece, then back at the woman standing in front of her. "I know," she said finally, her voice calm, steady in a way it hadn't been in a long time. Her daughter glanced past her, taking in the restored structure, the land stretching beyond it, the reality of something she clearly hadn't expected. "Can we talk?" she asked. Eleanor considered the question, not with hesitation, but with clarity. Then she nodded once. "We can talk," she said. But she didn't move aside. She didn't invite her in. Because this time, everything inside that tower, every wall, every document, every piece of what she had built, belonged to her. And for the first time in her life, she understood exactly what that meant.